So tell us a little bit about the book. What is it about?
So, title of the book is The Sacking of Fallujah, A People's History. And it's a revisionist account of the 3 sieges of Fallujah, starting with the US-led sieges in 2004, and then more recently the Iraqi-led siege in 2016. So I say revisionist because, during the US-led occupation of Iraq, there were a number of military accounts of these operations written, which really sort of just omitted the perspectives and experiences of Fallujahans. So we tried as much as we could to capture their perspective and to retell this story through their eyes as much as possible.
Okay. And what made you want to write this book?
Well, of course my interest with this topic starts with, I was a Marine in Iraq in 2004. I participated in the second siege of Fallujah. And although I didn't really fully understand what I was participating in, I still kind of understood that what I was being told by my command wasn't the full story. So once I got out, it took a couple years, but I eventually got involved in the anti-war movement. I think by 2010, I started an organization called the Justice for Fallujah Project. And it was basically just sort of an organization to raise public awareness about these operations and their human consequences. Then around the same time, I started writing a series of op-eds for The Guardian. So I started kind of trying to have these very public conversations, but it was happening primarily through social media, and as you might imagine, the comment section on a news article isn't the most productive place for these sorts of conversations. So I tried building a website, and part of what I wanted to do was to just compile as much documentation as I could, journalism, human rights reports, whatever. I created a primer on the operations in Fallujah, a reading list, just as a way to try to have more productive public conversations. And throughout all of this, I was in contact with my 2 co-authors on this book, Richard Hill, who co-authored a really great book called Erasing Iraq, and Donna Mulhearn, who is a journalist and human rights activist. She was working as a human shield during the first siege of Fallujah. At a certain point, we just decided that the bulk of the materials written about Fallujah are really propagandistic in nature, and I can explain why in a second. And there's almost nothing, portraying these events through the eyes of Fallujahans. So around 2013, I think that's when we started this project, and here we are in 2019. It's finally getting published. So it's been a long journey. But I'll back up a sec because I think this point about the propaganda is really important. So, the US invaded Iraq in 2013 with, the so-called Coalition of the Willing, and there was this multinational coalition of nations occupying the country from 2003 onwards. Several months into the occupation, started to emerge an insurgency. So in the Sunni provinces of Iraq, the city of Fallujah became sort of the center of the Sunni insurgency. This was a decentralized insurgency, lots of different militias, not all of them working in a very great way with one another. It was sometimes bad blood based on their different political beliefs, religious orientations, whatever their goals might have been. But broadly, these were nationalist organizations, not just Sunni nationalists, but Iraqi nationalists, who saw the occupation of Iraq as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. And even if they had sort of different political goals for what might come after they eject the foreign occupation, they were sort of unified in their opposition to this occupation. So Fallujah kind of became the center of this very diverse and complicated insurgency. And then there was sort of a inciting incident in the spring of 2004 where these American mercenaries working for the Blackwater USA Corporation decided they were going to try to take a shortcut through Fallujah, where they were ambushed, killed, bodies dragged out of their car, mutilated in this really brutal manner. But it was captured on film, and it became this really sensational media event. And the US responded by laying siege to the entire city of Fallujah, a city roughly the size, 300,000 people. And it was incredibly brutal. Somewhere between 700, 800 civilians were killed. What was really shocking about this was the US actually had to withdraw. They couldn't defeat the insurgent groups in Fallujah, partly because they were mostly comprised of former military people from Saddam's army, so they were skilled soldiers, right? But also because Al Jazeera was able to get a broadcast crew in Fallujah during this siege and caught on camera the consequences of US airstrikes, which killed civilians and also civilians being killed by soldiers on the ground, infantry soldiers. So partly because of the military skill of these militia groups, partly because of the international outrage from the footage broadcast by Al Jazeera, the US had to withdraw. About 6 months later, they tried to lay siege to Fallujah again. This time they had this very well-coordinated propaganda campaign trying to legitimize their assault on Fallujah, trying to demonize the insurgents as al-Qaeda terrorists, not true. Trying to make Fallujah out to be the base of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who's described as the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, who had made Fallujah his base, who was leading this terrorist insurgency from Fallujah and launching attacks all across Iraq. And this propaganda campaign was being run by a military discipline called information operations. And in our book, we analyzed this military discipline, information operations, and public affairs as a propaganda apparatus. And they put out an incredible amount of published works, whether it just be through embedded journalists, which they placed in military units, whether through commissioning military experts to do studies on the operations in Fallujah, conducting oral histories with leaders of these operations, and told a very misleading narrative about what happened in these operations. Essentially, the narrative that has stuck with most Americans is that the US forces came in and liberated the city of Fallujah from al-Qaeda terrorists who had taken control of the city and were basically holding the entire city captive. So, yeah, because of all this, because of the immense amount of propaganda that was put out on these operations, and because of the work that I was already doing, I teamed up with Richard and Donna, and we decided to write this book.
Wow. So why focus on the city of Fallujah? How does the history of U.S. operations in Fallujah help us to understand the broader history of the Anglo-American occupation in Iraq?
I mean, partly I think Fallujahans deserve to be listened to, and that's reason it's enough, I think. Also because I think this is a story that Americans need to hear. We have not faced any sort of accountability for what we've done to Iraq. We have nearly destroyed the entire nation. It doesn't look like they will recover in the near future. The US-led occupation was responsible for over 1 million Iraqi deaths. And I think Americans, they need to understand that. And I think we need to approach foreign policy decisions with that information in mind and start to make these decisions in a less abstract manner, taking into consideration the human consequences of what we're doing. Also, I think a careful study of the sieges of Fallujah helps us understand the occupation as a whole. First of all, it's a really insightful window into the nature of the Iraqi insurgency, which, as I said, through US information operations was falsely portrayed as an insurgency led by al-Qaeda. Instead, it was actually led by Iraqi nationalist organizations who saw themselves participating in a national liberation struggle. I think if you also look at the diversity of the Iraqi insurgency and look at the cooperation between Sunni organizations and Shia organizations in 2004 and see how the occupation saw that as a threat and took deliberate actions to fracture that unity as a sort of divide and conquer tactic, and how that fed into what was called in the media a civil war, I think that's a really important lesson. In fact, in this book, we analyze the so-called Civil War, which emerged in 2006, 2007, more as a dirty war, following the analysis of Jeremy Scahill. And I think if you look at the social movements happening around Fallujah around the time of 2013, it tells a very different story about the emergence of ISIS. The story that Americans are familiar with is that the city of Fallujah was ISIS's first major territorial gain in Iraq. And I think if you actually look at what was going on, that's misleading.
So, why write a people's history of these events? What does that perspective bring that is unique or looks at it through a different lens?
Yeah, like I said, I think Fallujahans deserve to be listened to, so we wanted to tell their story as much as we could. Also, I think the use of propaganda in Iraq during these operations was fundamentally different from the way propaganda had been used in warfare in earlier wars. Even in the Gulf War in '91, the Vietnam War, were more sort of like an ancillary effort to reframe U.S. actions. Instead, it was much more central to the planning and the conduct of military operations, and I think really constitutive of the violence itself. At least that's the argument we make in this book. And the challenge we faced by trying to tell a history of these events is the vast majority of the documentation was produced through what we're calling this propaganda apparatus, through the journalism of embedded journalists with military units, through the oral histories conducted by military public affairs, the numerous studies that they commissioned, all of these very uncritical studies of these operations in Fallujah, written by basically fans of the U.S. military, writing very sort of uncritical histories of these operations. And you really have to mine the alternative sources to look for the experiences of people from Fallujah, or to capture their voice and their perspective. So to not feel complicit in reproducing that sort of violence, that violence that I think was facilitated through information operations, we tried to read those sources as critically as possible and to counter them with these alternative sources, independent journalists, other scholarly works, or works of Iraqi journalists, as much as possible.
What do you most hope the book contributes to the public understanding of these events?
Of course, we want to counter this sort of official narrative that U.S. forces liberated the city of Fallujah from, the control of al-Qaeda terrorists. And this seems to be like one of the only really clear memories the American public has of the Iraq War. I mean, if you ask them about events in any other part of Iraq, like, people know Baghdad, people know Mosul, but can't tell you any particular battle that took place there. People can't tell you about the awakening militias. They can't tell you about, the Salvador option or the militias that were part of the interior minister. But, people have heard of the Battle of Fallujah. That's a name that kind of sticks with us. And it gets mentioned in popular works like this film War Dogs. They talk of it as a scene that takes place in Fallujah. Somehow Fallujah, more than others, has stuck in our collective memory of these events. So we want to sort of counter that narrative, but I also, and I have an invested interest in this because I'm part of a nonprofit organization called the Islam Reparations Project. And what we do is we try to bring reparations to Iraq. So I'm committed to that political goal. And I do hope that after reading this, Americans do feel a sense of societal, collective responsibility for what we've done to Iraq, and maybe are a bit more open-minded to the notion that we have a moral responsibility to bring reparations to Iraq.
So how do you think your training as a public historian influenced your work on this project?
Truthfully, the bulk of this book was written before I entered into this program. but being part of this program, taking public history courses at UMass has given me a lot of great ideas about, where to take this project from here. Mm-hmm. So the next phase of this is I'm working on a digital archive, People's History of Fallujah digital archive, which the way I'm kind of envisioning it now, it's sort of like a public digital primary source reader, but also like a digital organizing space for reparations actions to Iraq. So that's in the works. I'm hoping through this project to produce a bunch of classroom materials, which might be useful to high school students or college undergrads. I'd be really interested in trying to link up this project with the work being done by the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, doing really great work. And I've also started doing a series of oral histories with Iraqi refugees, particularly people from Fallujah.
So you mentioned the Isla Reparations project, which you serve on the board of directors for that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And also, the theme for NCPH this year in Hartford is repair work. How can this project sort of help us think about that idea of repair work, and how can other public historians better engage in it?
Yeah. So Islah is an Arabic word that refers to a tradition of restorative justice within Islam. So the way I think of what we do is it's a combination of aid and solidarity work, which we frame as reparations. And at first, this all kind of just came about as a pragmatic solution to trying to do aid work in Iraq, which was really difficult during the occupation, because so many different nonprofits, NGOs, charity organizations were trying to do this work, but also working with the occupation in a way that we felt was really inappropriate and mitigated a lot of the good that they were trying to do. And also, we just felt that it was wildly inappropriate to frame any kind of work in Iraq as help, since we are responsible for destroying this country and creating the need for the need for aid that we're trying to address. So we felt the correct way of framing this is as reparations, and we developed this sort of just pragmatic approach of working with Iraqi communities, letting them set the terms of the reparations work that we're doing, and really trying to let them set the priorities, and us just try to meet that the best we can. But all of this framework of grassroots reparations, this was sort of developed by our director, Callie Rubai, who's an anthropologist at Rice University right now. And she sort of took this approach to doing aid and solidarity work and developed it into more of sort of a philosophy, and applied it to her own work as an anthropologist. I think she calls it reparations ethnography, I think. And she's done this work with refugees from Fallujah and Anbar province. And basically there's sort of 5 principles to reparations. First, you have to begin this process with collaborative historical narration. Historical narration that gives a platform to our victims and that acknowledges our own responsibility in, our societal collective responsibility in harming other communities and societies, right? That's the first and most essential step. And really that's what I see this book project as. I hope it is sort of that first step in this whole process of social repair, right? But then from there, the second principle is reparations must be helpless. And this is kind of what distinguishes reparations from charity, in the sense that we don't pretend to be helping. We acknowledge our responsibility in creating this harm, so it necessarily can't be helped. Third, reparations must be ambiguous, in the sense that there isn't always a clear divide between perpetrators and victims. A lot of times, us as citizens of empire, we are locked into these violent systems that brutalize us too. And so that moral ambiguity, that's okay. We don't need to feel troubled by that. As long as you're trying to engage with that, you can still own our collective responsibility and take action on that. Fourth, reparations is an ongoing process, simple enough. And then fifth, reparations is work without absolution, in the sense that this isn't like charity where you give 20 bucks, feel better about yourself, and then move on with your day. What we would like is people to make a sustained commitment to this entire process of social repair. And it's not about us. It's not about us trying to no longer feel guilty or feel better about ourselves in some way. We feel it's a moral responsibility, and you just act on it. So that doesn't lead to a uniform path in different scenarios. It's going to look different based on whatever kind of work you're trying to do. But I do think it's a really helpful framework and set of principles to think about and to bring to other projects. So I hope other public historians will find it useful.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your book. We can't wait to read it.
Thanks for having me.